dawn of civilization, humanity did not view divinity as a boundless ocean of grace. It was something far more immediate, far more demanding, a powerful, temperamental landlord whose whims dictated whether your village ate or starved. The relationship between man and God was never one of unconditional acceptance. It was an ongoing contract, meticulously maintained by the currency of sacrifice. Before we can talk of blood bargains or ethereal debts, we must understand the fundamental structure of this perceived divine economy. Early human rites were deeply transactional. To appease a deity to ensure a good harvest, to keep the raiding parties at bay, even simply to guarantee that a young child would survive the passage into adulthood, you paid rent. And the nature of this payment was invariably something precious. An animal, a portion of the meager grain stores, or, ultimately, parts of oneself. These foundational belief systems viewed existence as precarious. Life itself, with all its unpredictable suffering and sudden joys, felt unearned, almost volatile. Therefore, divine favor could not be presumed. It had to be actively solicited and purchased. Sacrifice was simply the mechanism by which humanity attempted to stabilize a universe that otherwise seemed utterly chaotic and indifferent. The myths we read about in scrolls, the glorious processions, the solemn offerings of gold and exotic goods, are often breathtakingly beautiful narratives designed for posterity. But beneath the patina of high culture and opulent ritual lay something far more visceral: the grit of spilled blood, the smell of burning fat, the mundane reality of necessary loss. Every great temple was, fundamentally, a massive collection point for fear. And in those temples, every offering served to remind the worshipper, and perhaps to remind the gods themselves, of their own profound debt. The god did not merely reside on Olympus. It existed in a state of perpetual expectation. The true weight of these early contracts was psychological. To perform a sacrifice was not merely a religious act. It was an overwhelming declaration of humanity's subordinate place in the cosmic order. It acknowledged that life, despite its complexity and apparent freedom, remained ultimately conditional. You were forever owing something to something greater than yourself. Imagine the sheer collective effort required just to maintain this state of debt. Every major decision, whether to plant extra seeds, whether to marry a certain partner, even simply surviving another season, was framed by the question: what is the price? What must be offered today to guarantee stability tomorrow? This foundational pattern established an uncomfortable psychological habit in early civilization: the comfort found in impending doom. By accepting that life was unstable and required appeasement, humanity could structure its reality. The threat of divine wrath of famine, pestilence, or military defeat provided a framework for social order. It created rituals of compliance, communal duties, and structured piety. Fear, did not destabilize society. Rather, the management of fear became its most potent form of adhesive. The underlying assumption was this: if we understand the price, then at least we are in control of how best to pay it. If the plague arrives, the blame is given, and therefore a specific payment can be rendered, be it an offering from the richest house, or perhaps something more profoundly personal. This belief provided a structured outlet for existential terror. The casual sacrifice of property was just the beginning. It required material loss, but it did not necessitate a restructuring of the self. The highest form of divine exchange demanded something inherently unquantifiable: a piece of the soul, a lifetime's ambition, or perhaps even a willing participation in one's own destruction. The implication of this transactional cosmology is staggering. It taught humanity that nothing was free. Nothing, not success, not fertility, not wisdom, was owed to man simply because he existed. Everything had an invoice, and the most crucial line item was always surrender. Therefore, when we move beyond the early village rites and into the specialized cults of later civilizations, the pattern remains relentlessly consistent. Whether the transaction is paid in bushels of grain, in carefully preserved ritualistic flesh, or merely in adherence to a complex legal dogma, the god remains the ultimate arbiter of value, and man remains forever bankrupt. From the general premise that divinity was a demanding contract, nothing sacred felt free. The divine favor, once granted, always came with clauses and expiration dates. And in Athens, this transactional nature crystallized into something far more personal, more intimate, and far bloodier than any mere state sacrifice. Here, the rites were not communal displays of wealth, but intensely private negotiations for individual salvation. We are entering the realm of the mystery cults, systems designed to offer initiates a glimpse of an afterlife, or perhaps just a profound psychological reprieve from the mundane suffering of mortal life itself. The Athenian mysteries promised ascent, a passage beyond the veil of death that few other ancient systems dared suggest so vividly. But this promise was never cheap. To merely observe these rites was insufficient. One had to become complicit in them, to participate in a high degree of personalized, often terrifying emotional expenditure. The initial barrier to entrance was not simply piety or belief, but a profound psychological commitment, a willing descent into the unknown, accepting that life itself might be forfeit for the potential promise of glory. The initiates entered these cults carrying with them not just curiosity, but an acute sense of existential dissatisfaction. They were individuals who felt the harsh weight of fate upon their lives. They sought a guaranteed meaning beyond Athenian democracy and daily hardship. The deities they worshipped, whether Dionysus in his ecstatic frenzy or Eleusis in its veiled solemnity, were not distant celestial observers. They demanded visceral, immediate action. Consider the emotional labor inherent in this bargain. It was far more taxing than simply offering livestock. To commit oneself to a mystery cult meant accepting the possibility of ritual death, even if that physical death was only symbolic. The practitioner had to undergo rites of purification and self-abnegation so intense that they blurred the lines between genuine sacrifice and profound psychological withdrawal. They willingly endured humiliation, isolation, and vivid hallucinations, all steps taken to prove their worthiness and susceptibility to divine intervention. The ritual itself served as a crucible, burning away the superficial aspects of daily life and leaving only the raw core of the self exposed before the god. This was consuming in the truest sense. The cult required not just blood offerings from others, but the continuous, agonizing sacrifice of the initiate's own emotional security and personal autonomy. It was a deeply manipulative architecture of faith. By promising ultimate transcendence, the vision of rebirth, or joining an immortal realm, the mystery cults cornered their adherents into believing that only the most radical self-limitation could unlock the divine door. You did not negotiate for favor. You negotiated your right to exist in a transcendent sense. The mythologizing of personalized doom became central. The notion was that if life on earth was inherently chaotic, painful, and fleeting, then true order, true permanence, could only be accessed by embracing an orchestrated form of contained suffering. This cyclical view of pain, leading inevitably to apotheoses, resonated deeply with a population grappling with plagues, political instability, and the inescapable finality of mortality. The consequence for both the cult and the individual was profound psychological reordering. The initiate left not merely believing in gods, but believing in a specific process, that their current suffering was preparatory, that every failure, every rite of passage, was simply payment towards an eventual divine clearing. Their lives became structured around anticipation, the anticipation of the mystery, the revelation, the ultimate passing into grace. This obsessive dedication to controlled ritual death speaks volumes about humanity's perennial search for guaranteed meaning. The Athenian bargain offered a seductive solution. If you lose everything here, in this messy life, at least you might gain everything there, in the god's favor. And the desperation required to make that exchange, the willingness to sacrifice one's identity, comfort, and sometimes even reputation, is what defines these dark corners of ancient belief. It was an internalization of debt on a profound level. The faithful were always indebted to the gods for their existence in the first place, but more terrifyingly, they felt perpetually indebted to the mystery cult itself for providing the framework through which suffering could become meaningful again. And this deep-seated sense of indebtedness is the darkest and most compelling fuel source in human history's religious engine. This sets a dark precedent that emotional survival required ritualized loss, a pattern we will see recurring across cultures, from the agrarian plea for harvest to the intellectual surrender demanded by new scientific paradigms. The contract was set. Nothing was exempt from payment, not even the deepest ache of being alive. When the bounty failed, when the fields lay fallow, and the promised harvest was replaced by dust, civilization confronted its most elemental terror. The initial transaction, the blood payment for basic existence, suddenly felt inadequate. Sacrificing goats, or even valuable livestock, could not explain a blight that withered the grain from stalk to seed, nor quell the unnatural silence of drought-stricken rivers. In these deep agrarian societies, where life hinged absolutely on the erratic caprice of the earth itself, divine failure was interpreted as human deficit. The gods were not merely aloof landlords, they were capricious bureaucrats, demanding an unprecedented level of compliance. If Gaia, the Earth Mother herself, withheld her bounty, it meant something fundamental had broken in the relationship, and that breach required a uniquely profound payment. This desperation led to the development of what we might call the crop failure calculus. It is a terrifying equation. Unproductive earth equals sinful humanity. Thus, recovery requires radical atonement. When the breadbasket failed, the blame did not simply drift away with the wind. It coalesced into something palpable, directed squarely at the community's spiritual standing. The gods were understood to be offended by some flaw in the human collective, a breach of covenant, a lapse in ritual purity, or perhaps even a moral failing that had soured the fertile ground itself. And if sin was the poison, then sacrifice was the mandated antidote. The rituals designed to restore fertility ranged from the communal and highly organized to the brutally personal, often blurring the lines between animal atonement and human forfeiture. These were not mere Thanksgiving feasts. They were calculated attempts to trick nature back into productivity by paying an excessive spiritual debt. The focus shifted away from appeasing a distant sky god toward negotiating with the very ground beneath their feet, a powerful, demanding entity that embodied life itself. To make the earth smile again, you had to give it not just your best yield, but arguably your most vital component. The consequences were dire, fueling beliefs in localized rituals where entire village resources became bargaining chips. The community might oversee massive processions of grain and livestock that represented months of labor, all paraded before local deities whose mandates could determine if or not the seeds planted would sprout. Failure to produce meant a terrifying escalation. If the harvest was insufficient, perhaps the people themselves needed to contribute something irreplaceable. This desperation fueled mythologies were specific individuals, sometimes those deemed most ritually pure, sometimes the perceived worst elements of the community were identified as necessary components of the divine payment. They became sacrificial variables in an attempt to recalibrate a failed ecological system. The narrative was always one of systemic failure. The gods were displeased, the earth demanded blood or grain, and humanity's only recourse was absolute submission. Such practices reveal a profound psychological mechanism operating within collective belief. When survival itself is threatened, when the water tables drop to a trickle and starvation looms, the human mind abhors chaos above all else. It craves a narrative structure, even if that structure involves horrifying supernatural causality. The explanation for crop failure could not be dismissed as chance. It had to be framed as an act of will, a withdrawal of divine favor due to perceived cosmic offense. By identifying the specific sacrifice needed, be it a flawless bull or the highest-born daughter, the community regained a terrible, comforting sense of control. They replaced inexplicable physical threat with manageable spiritual debt. The solution was always localized. Identify the payment and make it. This reliance on ritualized forfeiture became deeply embedded in agrarian culture, linking prosperity inextricably to performance. The harvest rituals evolved into complex economic and social systems. Not only did the priest or specialized shaman guide these rites, they often functioned as controllers of vital resources and information. Only they knew which sacrifice was deemed sufficient at any given time. Was it a perfect load of grain from the best silo, or perhaps an offering involving intellectual tribute, like the crowning of a poet whose verse successfully placated the gods? The ritual became thus intertwined with societal stratification. Maintaining the necessary flow of divine favor required specialized knowledge and access to valuable goods. It was a controlled economy built on existential threat. The act of sacrificing not just surplus, but often irreplaceable elements, the best animals, the most potent seed stock, or even human life itself, served a dual function. It temporarily appeased the apparent volatility of divine favor, while simultaneously reinforcing the core social structure. The group that performed the sacrifice was bound together by shared terror and mutual dependency on the ritual success. It taught them, viscerally, that the collective survival was not guaranteed by their strength or wisdom, but only through continuous, costly appeasement to forces far greater than themselves. This mindset, that existence itself is a debt owed, is perhaps the most frightening and persistent aspect of human religion. The physical sacrifice in the field for the return of green shoots laid the foundation for all subsequent symbolic offerings. From the emotional investment required to maintain social standing to the career sacrifices demanded by modern corporate culture. In every epoch, when facing an insurmountable threat, a plague, a bad season, or simply the dread of insignificance, humanity's immediate and deeply ingrained instinct remains the same. Calculate the cost, identify the payment, and give it away in the hope that the terrifying cosmic ledger will once again balance. The promise whispered over withered crops is nothing more than the prelude to the ultimate offering. The bargain was never merely physical. While the ritual blood of Athenian cults and the desperate resources of the failing harvest provided palpable, undeniable transactions, life for grain, life for grace. The ultimate payment demanded by divinity proved to be something far more ethereal, far harder to quantify. As we move from the frenzy of mass sacrifice to the quiet precision of judgment, we find ourselves facing a pantheon of gods concerned less with brute offerings and more with immaculate spiritual accountancy. This brings us into the fertile, yet equally daunting, landscape of ancient Egypt, where survival hinged on much subtler forms of cost, not blood spilled in public ritual, but integrity measured deep within the self. The culmination of Egyptian belief was perhaps humanity's most profound early meditation on accountability. We are not speaking here simply of death, but of what followed it, a meticulous accounting before an invisible, demanding tribunal. The afterlife in Egypt was not a reward for mere compliance. It was a rigorous, multi-stage process of preparation and defense, requiring intellectual expenditure equal to the offerings themselves. Central to this system is the monumental ritual known as the weighing of the heart. This scene is less about divine acceptance and more about existential stress testing. The deceased arrived before Osiris and his panel of judges, a sophisticated bureaucratic afterlife system, and was immediately subjected to a trial of being. Their heart, believed to be the seat of intellect, emotion, and moral memory, was placed upon one scale, balancing against the feather of mad, representing truth, cosmic order, and universal justice. The stakes here are absolute. A life spent in sin or emotional cowardice meant imbalance, failure, and ultimate annihilation by the monstrous devourer, Ammit. The physical sacrifice of ritual blood was a public show of piety. The weighing of the heart was the most intimate, internal reckoning, the supreme self-audit. The preparation for this judgment demanded a staggering amount of costly effort. Think not only of the elaborate mummification process itself, a massive expenditure of labor, resources, and highly specialized knowledge, but also of the intellectual arsenal required to navigate it all. The spells, the funerary texts, the declarations of innocence before the tribunal, these were not mere poetry. They were legal documents, meticulously crafted statements designed to prove a life lived according to cosmic standards. Every single element of the ancient Egyptian bargain was predicated on preemptive action. You did not simply die and hope for the best. To survive death itself required generations of spiritual, material, and intellectual accumulation. The maintenance of tombs, the recitation of protective rites, the ensuring that your earthly life provided enough merit to balance the universal scale. What this system tells us about humanity is startling. We are intrinsically wired to believe in a scorekeeping mechanism. The notion that our every thought, every lapse in judgment, every secret ethical transgression would eventually be audited by an impartial divine body provides a structured framework for morality far more demanding than simple communal obedience. It demands self-reflection as the ultimate ritual offering. The contrast between this private reckoning and earlier public rituals is illuminating. In Athens, you sacrificed to appease a whim or achieve localized glory in agrarian rites. You paid debt to restore function to a failed world. But in Egypt, the payment was aimed at asterisk validation asterisk, the proof that your soul had accumulated enough virtue, knowledge, and righteous action across an entire lifetime to merit continued existence. The gods demanded not merely blood, but perfection of memory. This meticulous concern for moral balance leads us naturally toward considering how societies manage ethical failure when no divine tribunal is visible. If the greatest sacrifice was not a bull on the altar, but the purity of one's soul before judgment, then modern society has developed its own elaborate systems of spiritual accounting. We have traded Amit for something less literal, yet equally merciless: public opinion. Consider the social structures that attempt to manage moral truth in the absence of pharaohs and priests. The ancient concept of mad, that perfect balance between cosmic law and earthly order, was a comprehensive worldview. If you violated mad, whether by theft, betrayal, or simply failing to maintain proper religious rituals, you were not just disappointing your neighbors, you were disrupting the fundamental physical laws that allowed the Nile to flood and the crops to grow. The weight of this understanding is crucial. It implies a form of social contract so profoundly moralizing that the crime was rarely defined by statute law alone, but by one's resonance with established truth. The psychological demand was total alignment. You had to believe not only in the divine order, but that your entire life force contributed perfectly to its maintenance. This deep cultural emphasis on inner spiritual payment is the critical transition point of our journey. It shows us that when humanity masters the technology of agriculture and build complex civilizations, the nature of sacrifice does not diminish. It simply becomes more internalized. The altar moves from a public structure made of stone and bronze to an internal chamber of conscience. The gods no longer demanded the cattle or the lifeblood, but rather the unwavering narrative of the self, a flawlessly curated story that proved worthiness for the continued miracle of existence. And this internalization sets the stage perfectly for our examination of later belief systems, revealing a pattern that is both consistent and frighteningly adaptable. The sophisticated bargaining chip required to cross the threshold into the afterlife was simply another form of high-stakes transactional theology, a divine premium paid in the currency of ethical perfection and enduring spiritual effort. It taught us, perhaps more than any ritual offering, that sometimes believing in a greater, immutable ledger is far more powerful than simply accepting fate. We approach a turning point in the grand history of human belief, a passage through which the fundamental nature of sacrifice underwent a profound and perhaps cynical transformation. Through millennia of ritual payment, the visible cost of appeasement shifted dramatically, moving from the tangible blood of beasts and lives to something far more elusive: abstract obedience. When we consider the pagan landscape up until this point, the transaction was brutally clear: a life for a promise, a harvest for favor, a spirit for passage into the underworld. The sacrifice was monumental, visible, and definitive. But then came the rise of belief systems that sought to internalize the act of payment, demanding an accounting not just at the altar, but within the human heart itself. This shift is perhaps most dramatically illustrated in the transition towards what would become early Christian thought. It represents a profound theological sleight of hand, one which deserves our deepest scrutiny. How does one navigate the conceptual leap from the literal rendering of sacrificial lambs, a concrete payment designed to satiate a visible divine rage, to the notion of vicarious atonement, achieved through abstract suffering and obedience? It is a transition that maintains the core mechanism of transactional debt, while sanitizing the gruesome spectacle of the offering. The power here lies in its internalization. The pagan deity demanded external proof: blood spilled on stone, or physical resources consumed by fire. The emerging system, however, redirects the focus entirely inward. The supreme cost is not measured in livestock or gold, but in submission, in endurance, and most damningly, in human spiritual acceptance of suffering as a necessary pathway to salvation. This change demands a level of intellectual and emotional investment that perhaps surpasses even the commitment required by Athenian cults. In those rites, one accepted immediate danger for perceived transcendence. Here, the payment becomes a form of existential narrative commitment, a belief system so totalizing that refusing it means not just divine displeasure, but spiritual non-existence. The sacrifice is reframed as suffering endured for a promise of grace. The physical debt demanded by the old gods gave way to a metaphysical one paid through internalized self-denial and the willingness to accept an ultimate loss, the very sense of self that predates the belief system itself. It was less about preventing famine or passing the soul across the river Styx, and more about reconciling humanity's inherent imperfections with a perfect divine plan. The enduring power of this mechanism is its subtlety. It allows the requirement for sacrifice to persist without needing a visible altar or a pool of spilled blood. The greatest payment becomes one's own adherence, the continuous performance of spiritual debt repayment in daily life through doctrine, ritual observance, and social conformity. If we track the necessity of cost across these chapters, a disturbing consistency emerges. In early times, if you failed to offer enough goats, your village starved. Later, if your heart was unclean, your soul perished before judgment. Now, in this conceptual phase, if your obedience wavers, or if your belief becomes too intellectual, the spiritual penalty is existential oblivion. The sheer scale of the proposed debt expands from merely surviving a poor harvest to achieving ultimate divine reconciliation. The implication for us who study this history is sobering. Whether facing the unpredictable wrath of Gaia, the inevitable accounting of Osiris, or the conceptual demands placed upon a believer in abstract sin and redemption, humanity has always found profound psychological comfort not in freedom, but in structure, a structure defined by quantifiable loss and inescapable debt. The fear of divine anger was simply rebranded into the anxiety of moral failing. This transformation shows that the need for sacrifice is not tied to the specific pantheon or the theological dogma. It is woven into the fabric of human consciousness itself. We crave boundaries, we demand cosmic scorekeeping, and we are perpetually comforted by the notion that every great gift, every promise of meaning, stability, or salvation must be preceded by an equally profound accounting of loss. This recurring pattern establishes a debt structure. Everything offered must always cost something precious. The question that haunts our examination is whether this need for definitive payment is merely anthropological, or if it speaks to a deeper, perhaps permanent, structural weakness within the human psyche, a foundational comfort with accepting necessary suffering in order to feel ordered, thereby making us perpetual debtors to whatever system purports to grant meaning. If the gods of antiquity demanded blood, then in the shadowed heart of medieval Europe, they often required something far more obscure and insidious. Forget the grand altars of Rome or the predictable piles of sacrificed livestock. Here, the payment was whispered, negotiated in dusty backrooms, bound by oaths on parchment, or hidden within the desperate folklore passed from generation to generation. We move now into what feels less like organized religion and more like a decentralized black market for spiritual security, a place where enlightenment itself might require a forfeiture. The prevailing wisdom was simple. If life was threatened by unseen forces, plagues, sudden bad harvests, the persistent creep of superstitious fear, then maintaining order required ritual expenditure. But unlike the public rites that stained colossal sacrificial altars, these medieval payments were clandestine. They thrived in secrecy, lending them an atmosphere of desperate intensity. The true high-stakes spirituality lay not in the cathedral nave, but in the alleyways and secretive gatherings where knowledge was power, and power demanded a dreadful price. In this era, salvation wasn't a publicly administered grace. It was a closely guarded secret, accessible only to those willing to undergo extreme personal forfeiture. The remedies for misfortune were rarely simple prayers. They involved charms, complex sigils scratched into wood, esoteric potions brewed from nightshade and bone meal, or profoundly binding oaths sworn under threat of eternal damnation. Every protective rite demanded participation, transforming the supplicant into an active participant in their own supposed deliverance. You weren't just asking for favor, you were engaging in a highly personalized contract with forces barely understood, forces that seemed to operate by internal medieval logic. The fear was specific and tangible. It arrived not as abstract cosmic displeasure, but as a visible entity. The pox marked upon a child's skin, the blight curling across wheat fields, the whispered accusation of witchcraft against a neighbor's hearth. And because these threats felt so immediate, the required sacrifices, both material and emotional, felt equally urgent and absolute. The black magic rites operated on the premise that all misfortune was attributable to either divine slight or malicious intervention. This necessitated two opposing forms of costly appeasement. First, a proactive payment made to appease generalized forces, the saints, the dead, the volatile elementals. And second, a defensive sacrifice against specific enemies, whether those enemies were malevolent witches or merely bad luck incarnate. We see this vividly in the rituals intended to ward off illness. The required payments often involved physical purification that skirted the edge of self-mutilation. Charms might demand one's hair be cut at midnight, a precise number of herbs gathered before dawn, or even the temporary forfeiture of property, a lock of one's most prized possessions given up to prove sincere dedication to the rite. The goal wasn't merely protection. It was the demonstration of spiritual desperation, combined with meticulous adherence to arcane rules. Any lapse in procedure, any deviation from the prescribed sequence, meant the ritual failed, and the consequences were terrifyingly real. Consider the oaths. These were perhaps the most terrifying form of sacrifice, because they required nothing external to be given up, only the integrity of one's own future actions. To swear an oath by sacred relics, or by invoking a specific demon, was to bind oneself into a legal and spiritual debt that transcended mortal life. The payment for breaking that bond, or even simply accepting it, felt utterly catastrophic. This localized system meant that spirituality was hyper-individualized and often extremely dangerous, unlike the grand theological structures we have examined, which at least provided universal language of sin and atonement. The black market rites dealt in niche terrors. To understand their logic, one must accept that knowledge itself was a commodity bought with risk. The ability to read obscure Latin verses or to possess knowledge of herbal toxicology conferred a temporary status of immunity within certain circles, but this privilege always carried its own cost: secrecy, exclusion, and the threat of being branded an heretic. The Enlightenment, in this context, was not merely intellectual, it was magical. It was the ability to understand patterns that others believed were purely capricious or divine whim. The desperate search for codified knowledge, be it alchemical formulae or forgotten astrological alignments, drove immense sacrifices. The sacrificing of stable social standing for esoteric insight, the abandonment of family life for academic pursuit in forbidden libraries. The consequence, however, was often a deeper entanglement with the very system that promised deliverance. Once you accepted the transactional nature of salvation, that survival required payment, you became conditioned to believe that every subsequent failure, every moment of malaise or poverty was simply evidence that your spiritual debt had accumulated too high. The initial exchange of trinkets and oaths gradually expanded into a lifetime commitment to perpetual, anxious observance. This establishes the critical connection we must carry forward. Whether through required blood offerings in ancient Athens or the meticulous mental accounting demanded by Egyptian priests, the underlying human mechanism is remarkably consistent. We find comfort not in boundless grace, but in the quantifiable debt, the ability to measure suffering, and therefore believe that an equally measurable offering can restore equilibrium. The medieval black market merely refined this commodity, proving that fear, coupled with the promise of localized control, remained one of humanity's most profitable and darkest spiritual currencies. The dread of the plague was not merely a biological event. It was an economic crisis played out on the stage of the human soul. When the pestilence arrived, divinity did not send divine medicine. Instead, it presented a terrifying ledger book, demanding payment in blood, or worse, in social currency. The natural response to uncontrollable death is desperation, and that desperation always finds a scapegoat, always attaching the burden of collapse to something manageable, something quantifiable. We are talking about the plague economy, where fear itself became a commodity to be traded. To live meant participating in endless acts of preventative sacrifice. The very act of surviving was therefore transactional. Fear transformed into a market system far more ruthless than any earthly bazaar. If death was inevitable, then protection must have a price tag. And that currency wasn't gold, though coins were often burned at purification rites. It was reputation. It was obedience. It was the willing forfeiture of self in exchange for the illusion of safety. In these feverish times, the boundaries between piety, paranoia, and public finance dissolved entirely. People did not simply pray, they bought appeasement. They purchased immunity through visible acts of penance. Entire communities began to view their existence as a ledger account with some unseen, unforgiving cosmic accountant. If we faltered in our payments, if we were too complacent, or perhaps just ill, the debt came due, the shroud. The ritual became intensely localized and profoundly suspicious. When facing an invisible killer that defied medical understanding, people clung to what was tangible: rules, purity standards, and accusations. Cleansing oneself of sin became a paid service. Purification rituals demanded specific forfeitures of time, property, or bodily autonomy. You might surrender your best linens for a blessing, or promise years of servitude to the religious authorities in exchange for exclusion from the contagion. This is where the economy of suffering flourishes. If physical sickness was bad enough, spiritual malady had to be addressed first. Suspicion became both currency and defense mechanism. It was easier, psychologically speaking, to point a finger at a neighbor, to declare them tainted by sin or marked by foreign blood, than to admit that the plague was indifferent to human suffering. The scapegoat system is nothing more than the ultimate form of social accounting. One person pays the accumulated spiritual debt of an entire neighborhood simply through accusation. Their life becomes the symbolic sacrifice required to balance the ledger of communal guilt. The process demanded a terrifying amount of collective psychological energy. Not only did people hoard grain and water, but they hoarded belief. They manufactured urgency, transforming deep-seated existential dread into immediate, actionable transactions. If you couldn't defeat death with a sword or an herb, you defeated it by adhering absolutely to the rigid rules of perceived holiness. Deviating from accepted ritual meant risking contamination. Questioning the high priest's pronouncement was not merely dissent, it was a spiritual liability. The dark humor inherent in this history is astounding. In the face of utter oblivion, humanity managed to invent intricate systems of micro-transactional terror. One paid for safe burial plots, another bought guaranteed rites of passage, and yet, most subtly, all paid simply for the right to still call themselves a functioning social unit. Their adherence was a performance meticulously designed to convince both God and neighbor that they had successfully kept pace with the horrific demands of the plague economy. Even when the plague subsided, the transactional habit remained imprinted upon the cultural psyche. Survival taught them not merely how to live, but how to pay asterisk for the right to continue living. the suspicion didn't fade, it professionalized. They learned that vulnerability was a negotiable weakness, and resilience, or at least the appearance of it, was always purchased with some form of sacrifice. Thus, we see the foundational principle crystallized. Suffering is not merely an affliction, it is a commodity. And when humanity feels itself to be under imminent threat from forces utterly beyond its control, be they cosmic plagues, political upheavals, or intellectual paradigms, it immediately looks for something to offload, something to spend, something that can buy back the feeling of security. This desire transforms collective agony into structured participation. We are forced to believe that there is a proper mechanism of debt and repayment, even if the creditor is nothing more than abstract terror. It was in these feverish markets of fear that humanity learned its most enduring and unsettling lesson: that some sacrifices, the sacrifice of truth, the sacrifice of neighborly compassion, the sacrifice of simple reason, are not just optional contributions to faith. They become mandatory payments for the continuation of civilization itself. If the divine was always a demanding landlord, whose rent was paid in blood or grain, we have followed the tracks of sacrifice from the altars of ancient kings to the desperate alleys of medieval healers. We saw that payment was fundamentally about managing existential dread, a structured way to convert terrifying uncertainty into manageable debt. But what happens when the danger ceases to be overtly physical, when the plague has been contained, and the earth is once again yielding its harvest? Where does humanity direct its sacrificial impulse next? It moves inward, toward the most treacherous and intangible commodities: the self's mind, its ideas, and its reputation. We enter the crucible of the Renaissance mind, a period defined by rediscovery, burgeoning skepticism, and a desperate yearning to reconcile classical wisdom with nascent scientific inquiry. This was not an era simply requiring goats or bodies. It demanded intellectual allegiance. To survive in this vibrant, tumultuous intellectual landscape meant submitting to dogma that had no physical manifestation, yet carried the weight of ultimate consequence. The sacrifice here is knowledge itself. The most valuable offering is the capacity to think outside the established scholarly framework. Consider the flourishing academies where authority rested not on divine mandate alone, but on adherence to a specific canon of thought, be it Neoplatonic philosophy, Aristotelian logic, or emerging cartographical science. To be considered enlightened meant accepting an intellectual contract. You would contribute your sharpest reasoning, yes, but only within the boundaries of what was already accepted. The consequences for divergence were ruinous. An unproven hypothesis, a challenge to the established hierarchy of knowledge, did not simply earn a disagreement. It could result in academic ostracization, loss of patronage, and social erasure, a death sentence delivered by rumor and scholarly exclusion. The penalty was the intellectual forfeiture of one's life work, one's entire sense of belonging. This pattern mirrors ancient payment perfectly. The community dictates what is acceptable, and the individual must sacrifice aspects of their unique truth to maintain membership in the privileged collective. It is a far more subtle and insidious mechanism than offering a sacrificed lamb. Here, the bloodshed is not crimson, it is conceptual. The death is one of potentiality. Think of the burgeoning sciences, where Renaissance humanists rediscovered texts lost to time. These scholars were driven by a fervor that bordered on manic possession, believing they held the keys to understanding nature's divine architecture. Yet even their pursuit was curtailed. They had to sacrifice parts of their curiosity, the sheer delight in asking an unanswerable question, to validate and synthesize the findings within accepted disciplinary structures. The desire for breakthrough demanded conformity. The intellectual offering was essentially a sophisticated, highly formalized cult of consensus. The individual was compelled to participate in a continuous self-censorship, polishing radical thoughts until they were palatable whispers that fit neatly between established pillars of thought. This academic sacrifice is the profound internalization of debt. Instead of asking a goddess for safe passage across a river or a good harvest, the scholar asks his peers and mentors for validation, for the right to speak at all. And the payment required is often the relinquishing of certainty, the admission that one does not know enough, even when one feels brilliant. The Renaissance teaches us that intellectual freedom, like physical life, can be treated as conditional, a gift granted only with the understanding that one must pay rent in adherence to established canons. The genius who dares to speak too loudly or too differently finds his words gently but permanently stifled by the very community that initially celebrated him. We are seeing humanity transition from paying literal debts to abstract ones. We move away from the visible rite of sacrifice and into the invisible transaction of credulity, the belief in the authority of the prevailing thought structure itself. The greatest danger is accepting the limited nature of one's own understanding simply because that limitation offers comfort and belonging. And this, we observe, sets a crucial precedent for all modern times. If Renaissance elites required us to sacrifice our radical ideas on the altar of established philosophy, what will modern society require us to discard? What abstract commodity, our emotional availability, our personal truth, our skepticism, or even our sense of intellectual independence will serve as the next divine payment? The transition is complete. The blood and bone have been replaced by the discourse and the data point. And humanity, forever conditioned by millennia of transactional belief, remains profoundly susceptible to accepting the terms, no matter how intangible the final debt. We thought the sacred bargain had ended with the fall of empires, and the rise of secular reason. We believed that by plumbing the depths of logic, science, and free will, we had finally transcended the ancient requirement for appeasement. Yet, as we examine our own contemporary lives, this gleaming, hyper-connected age of instantaneous consumption, we find that the fundamental mechanism remains terrifyingly intact. The demand for sacrifice has not vanished. It has simply changed its ledger. It no longer calls for the blood of a goat, nor the grain from a failing harvest. Our modern gods are quieter, more pervasive, and far harder to identify. They are built into the architecture of our desires. We have followed the thread of sacrifice through millennia. We saw divinity as a landlord demanding rent in ancient temples, an existential debt paid with the harvest and blood during plague times, and a moral ledger settled by the weighing of hearts. In the Renaissance, we learned that the ultimate offering was not physical, it was intellectual, costing us dissenting thoughts and alternative lives. The patterns were clear. Humanity's comfort derived from quantifying threat. We needed to believe in an inevitable payment plan, because facing pure, untamed existence is a psychological impossibility. And so, we have arrived at the quiet, unsettling understanding that our relationship with debt, the belief that every benefit requires compensation, is itself a deeply ingrained cultural ritual. It dictates how we structure meaning. If nothing demands a price, then nothing matters. We are creatures who find security in the contract. This comfort is not a sign of advancement. It is merely the persistence of an ancient psychological mechanism writ large onto modern life. Think back to those high-stakes economies, the desperation when the crops failed, demanding entire flocks, the meticulous accounting required just to cheat death in the afterlife, requiring every piece of knowledge and every scrap of physical effort. These were methods of appeasement for visible gods, whose anger could manifest as drought or pestilence. But what happens when the divine is no longer external? What happens when the ultimate, uncontrollable power source shifts from sky gods and underworld spirits to something entirely internal, self-generated, and perpetually demanding? The sacred contract simply migrated inward. It moved from the altar stone and the census bureau into our personal calendars, our professional aspirations, and our endless feeds of curated perfection. We have exchanged the predictable blood sacrifice for voluntary, abstract surrender. Our modern deities are not bearded patriarchs on a mountaintop. They are metrics, achievements, perceived social standing, and emotional availability. They demand currency we didn't know existed, time itself, fractured into micro-payments of attention and effort. The debt is permanent, the repayment schedule infinite, and the ultimate collateral is our authentic self. Consider the modern pressure to achieve a kind of perfect equilibrium, a career that simultaneously demands unrelenting ascent while allowing for personal life, a physical body that must signal perpetual health in a perpetually demanding visual culture, or a digital identity that requires constant, exhausting maintenance. These are not simply goals. They function as spiritual rites. They are rituals designed to appease the invisible powers that govern our self-worth, the modern divine forces of productivity and visibility. We have normalized the notion of permanent deficit. We treat fulfillment not as an inherent state of being, but as a delayed dividend awaiting the next qualification exam. The architecture of our daily lives is built on conditional acceptance. Every purchase must validate us. Every relationship must prove itself worthy of sustained investment. Every quiet moment requires justification against the looming threat of inadequacy. This constant maintenance state, this permanent indebtedness to expectation, provides a strange, haunting sense of order. It tells us, if we pay enough attention, if we achieve enough visibility, if we keep accumulating the necessary markers of success, then perhaps, just perhaps, the cosmic overdraft will not take us. The mechanism worked so well that we forgot the origin point. We forgot that our ancestors believed the debt was paid to a capricious force, external to their existence, a demanding sky god, or an indifferent earth spirit. Now, we administer the payments ourselves, becoming the unpaid creditors and the perpetually indebted debtors all at once. It is a masterpiece of self-enslavement, and this is where the deepest irony lies, that the psychological comfort derived from believing in impending doom, the structure provided by the cost, is far more potent than the fleeting relief of acceptance. Knowing what we stand to lose, or what must be done to prevent loss, gives our transient lives a defined gravity. We mistake the weight of obligation for the substance of meaning. The ultimate payment remains unknown, always hovering just beyond our grasp, ensuring that the narrative never ends and the contracts are never truly fulfilled. We live not in a state of grace or abundance, but within the comforting illusion of negotiation, forever servicing the invisible payments to keep the cosmic lights on. And when we finally understand this, that life itself has become merely the continuation of a perpetually payable account balance, we stand at the precipice of a profound cultural crisis, realizing that perhaps the most radical act of rebellion is simply refusing